Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair, and on behalf of Hudson Institute, it is a great honor to be hosting this discussion on the United States and South Korea and how the strategic alignment between these two close allies can carry forward into the Trump administration. This has been a growing issue and debate. Anybody in this room and online watching knows that our allies are anxious about the uncertainty of a political transition, especially this transition. I'm here to mostly reassure our allies that there are some great opportunities, but there's going to be some disruption. There are going to be changes as well. I've got a great group of experts who have joined us today, so I'm going to rely heavily on them, but I've been also working on this issue closely over the past year, thanks in large part to the Korea Foundation. And I will be just telling you that there are at least, oops. I want to deal with 5 strategic challenges that I've been focused heavily on. The first one, which I've changed the name on, asymmetry of threat, is a reminder, oops, no, what's happening? The asymmetry of threat is a reminder that the Trump administration will be coming in heavily focused on the China challenge. And South Korea cannot but help focus on the DPRK challenge, first and foremost. It's part of Korea. It's a growing nuclear challenge. It has an axis cooperation with especially Russia. The difference between these two challenges, though, is what structurally is going to create the disruption in the alliance, because the Trump administration has been elected in large part, I believe, but we're going to hear from Randy Shriver in a minute, who knows deeply about these issues, that we have to do more together to deal with a holistic competition that is coming from China. And that's going to drive essentially a new bargain. So we can't ignore the fact that DPRK has actually adopted the hostile policy. The hostile policy they accuse us of, they're actually the perpetrators of a hostile policy right now in terms of trying to write South Korea off the map and out of sovereignty. And they're aligning with Russia. So we have to deal with both of these challenges, and I think we can through a new bargain. Especially thinking about the Ukraine war right now and how this will lead to a ceasefire. On top of the gray zone operations we've seen throughout maritime Asia, there's a great concern that the might makes right approach could become the new norm. And making sure that doesn't happen is a shared value and interest, I think, of the United States and South Korea and other allies that we're going to have to mind. And that deals with scenarios like Taiwan, as well as on the Korean Peninsula. I think the new nuclear age, and we've got Ankit Panda here, he's going to circle us issue on the panel with a lot of his great wisdom on the nuclear issues in particular. But we have a real challenge about maintaining extended deterrence, the credibility of extended deterrence in the alliance context. We have a great challenge in making sure that the coercive uses of nuclear force are not enhanced. And so those twin challenges are really difficult when you have certain countries like Russia, China, North Korea, cooperating on nuclear issues, building up nuclear issues, and we're going to have to manage these issues. I think the fourth issue of major power competition here is just to remind in the alliance context how much of this is about values. Olivia's here in terms of thinking about human rights and basic values. Those may not be on the front burner of a Trump administration, but they're going to be on the front burner for the American people always in terms of maintaining democracy and human rights. And they're baked into the South Korean policy of Yoon Suk-yeol. So it's going to be very important on top of the fact that we're really dealing with economic competition. And that's why this technology arms race that we're essentially in is so important, because both in terms of cutting edge technologies, emerging technologies for economic purpose and for military purpose will be at the forefront of this competition. And that's why bringing this alliance into a technology alliance, even though there are asymmetries there to deal with, including South Korea's market dependence on China, we're going to have to manage these differences. So we're going to need a different bargain, essentially, where the Trump administration coming in is going to reaffirm the security guarantees and have a stronger U.S. posture overall in exchange for South Korea doing what it's already doing, which is playing this this global pivotal state, standing up and playing a larger role, whether it's in a G9 or whether it's thinking about Taiwan contingencies, as we'll hear in a minute. It's going to have to play a role that matches the challenges of both the DPRK hostile policy and the China challenge. There are obviously other challenges. These are 5 that I'm focusing on in the report that will be forthcoming. We're going to hear a lot of expert views about these issues, but first, let me introduce our speakers. Randy Shriver is chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute, but Randy's really just one of the top American experts on policy in the Indo-Pacific and Asia. So I met Randy when he was back in the Office of the Secretary of Defense there working as the lead point man on dealing with the PLA and on the PLA. So he's no newcomer to thinking about these issues. He'd already been in the attaché's office in Beijing, in active duty as a naval intelligence officer of some distinction before he went up and became the leading policy figure that he became, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and the Pacific during the George W. Bush administration, and then rising to become the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific in the first Trump administration. So it is a great honor to introduce an old friend, somebody I have great respect for, Randy Shriver. And before I do that, Randy, I'm just going to let people know that after Randy Shriver's comments, we're going to move into a virtual discussion from Professor Kim, who's joining us from Seoul. Yean Nam, our Korea Foundation researcher, is going to speak about her research on Taiwan. And then we're going to break this podium up, and we're going to have a panel discussion with the distinguished panelists I will introduce in person when we sit down. But first, or at least now, please join me in welcoming Randy Shriver. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Patrick, for that very kind introduction, and thank you also for leaving out the year we first met. But that was 30 years ago, I believe. I started in OSD in 1994, so it has indeed been a long friendship, and appreciate your friendship and all the support over the years. So when I left the Pentagon on my most recent tour, which was the end of 2019, so pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, as I was doing my outbriefs to senior leaders in the department, I would tell anybody and everybody, anybody who would listen, that the relationship I was most concerned about was the U.S.-ROK alliance. And if you recall at the time, I'm sure everyone in this room does, it was a difficult period. We had gotten in a bitter dispute over the special measures agreement and the issue of burden sharing. We had unilaterally on the U.S. side pulled down the major exercises that we had normally done on an annual basis on the peninsula. We had a dispute between Japan and Korea over an instance at sea, which led to a further dispute about Jasomia, which the U.S. Was fairly ineffective in trying to broker some understanding between the two sides in reconciliation. We had, I would say, at the leader level, a bit of a difficult relationship between President Trump and, at the time, President Moon Jae-in. So it was a concern, and the backdrop for all of that is the diplomacy with Kim Jong-un had not been successful in terms of the goal of denuclearization, and the threat environment was growing more complex. So fast forward 4 years later, and what a different world we're in. I think the Biden administration and the Yoon administration deserve a lot of credit. The alliance is in very good health, and in fact, much of what was adjusted during the Trump administration, particularly on the military side with exercises and the like, has been restored. But we've also made even further progress, particularly on that trilateral piece, as I'm sure is known to all. The so-called spirit of Camp David is really quite an impressive achievement in terms of the agenda that's been set forth, and now the secretariat being established. These are all very, very positive developments. So what will we see in a second Trump term? Will it be a reversion to the difficult times, or will the momentum be sustained? And I can offer just a few thoughts on that. And I'll caveat everything by saying there's more that we don't know than what we know. We know what the inheritance will roughly look like, and it is an extremely complex geopolitical landscape with China's continuing assertiveness, but now also this axis of authoritarianism, as some are referring to it, with China, North Korea, Russia, Iran in some instances. The intensification of U.S.-China competition. So the inheritance is indeed a complex one, notwithstanding the fact that the alliance itself is in very good health and good standing. We know what the track record of a first term was and what some of the instincts of the president are related to alliances and related to some of these challenges. We know what was said during the course of the campaign. We know some of the key players, particularly at the cabinet level. Not sure all will get confirmed, but we know who has been named. So based on this, what are some of the things we can say? So I think number one, the China focus will continue, and the early policy initiatives will mostly be in the economic space. There's obviously talked a lot about tariffs. I don't know if there'll be 60% tariffs, but the president has a pretty free hand on this, given the 301 investigations and the opportunity to, through executive action, make adjustments to the tariffs based on that. He would be more restricted if he sought to do global tariffs. Congress has that prerogative to have a hand in that, but with the ongoing investigation, he can do the China tariffs immediately. I think it'll go beyond tariffs, though. I think there's a lot of interest in right-shaping a lot of the trade and economic relationship with China, in working in concert with allies in Congress to further tighten export controls in key sectors and broaden them. I think there will be moves on, for example, biopharma. I think there will be efforts to really enhance the outbound investment reviews, which obviously there's an initial step taken through executive order, but working with Congress, I think that'll be legislated, and there'll be more resources to make that meaningful in terms of the oversight and implementation. And that will put, some amount of stress on our allies and partners. First of all, understanding the direction of things. The previous Trump administration, I think one of the flaws was communication and transparency within our alliances. But I suspect this will be somewhat fast-moving, and there will be some expectation that allies will follow suit or take similar actions, particularly in the export control space, but I would say maybe even more broadly than that. So that's, I think, will be an early kind of test of sorts. Even if we're like-minded in the long-range challenge, there might be some stresses there. I think number two, you can expect at least attempts to raise the defense budget on the U.S. side. This will be interesting to try to find $2 trillion of savings when we're not going to touch entitlements. We can't touch the interest on the national debt, and we're going to raise defense spending. But we'll leave that to the brilliance of Elon and Vivek. But I think the intention, and I think Congress will go along with it, although some House Republicans will question if the increases are going to be offset elsewhere. But I think the intention and the likely outcome is some increase in defense spending, which I think is appropriate. I mean, we have a very large defense budget, $800 billion or so. But in fact, the last few years, despite saying China is a generational challenge, we haven't had defense budgets that have kept pace with inflation. So I think there will be more committed there. That, depending on how those resources are used and how they're invested, one would presume the Indo-Pacific would be a beneficiary of that. But that also leads to a second-order effect, which is there will be pressure on allies and partners to spend more. Now, South Korea should be in a pretty good category there. I think my recollection is it's maybe number 3 among our allies and partners in terms of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. It's behind Poland and I think one other. But that may not matter. Israel, somebody said, yes. But that may not matter. There have been at least some representatives of the campaign who have looked at Japan, for example, and said, oh, you're doubling defense budgets in 5 years. That's impressive. Still not enough. So I think there will be some pressure on partners and allies to increase their own defense spending and contributions to burden sharing. I think the positive aspect of this is the SMA appears to be taken care of and off the table for now. And it was a very good outcome, and I think a generous move on the part of South Korea. So the acute point of difference in the first term seems to be off the table, and I think that all actually clears some other issues as well, too. I think some of the decisions about taking down exercises related to leverage for those negotiations, not just the diplomacy with North Korea. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that kind of pressure that might be applied to that. I think number three, we will have to understand how the interrelated conflicts, including in Europe and in the Middle East, will affect the competition with China, the views of North Korea, and the expectations on partners and allies. I think we're still sort of, as an analytical community, sorting through what this access means for North Korea and stability on the peninsula. We know what Russia's getting out of this, right? We know they're getting munitions, artillery, they're getting now troops on the front line. A little less clear what North Korea is getting out of it, but we can take pretty good guesses in terms of Russian support for military modernization in key areas like strategic weapon systems that North Korea has, professionalization of the force, training. So this is something that we'll have to really kind of work to understand and then accommodate and adjust as an alliance. I mentioned this even though the specificity is not there, because I think the president's time and energy will at the outset be focused on the Ukraine conflict. I suspect it's not going to be solved in 24 hours. I don't know, maybe somebody out there disagrees with me, but you know, how can the president affect this? He's either going to have to go to Zelensky and say, we're cutting you off unless you make a deal, which would probably mean giving up some territory, or he goes to Putin and says, you know, if you're unwilling to make a deal or do a ceasefire, we're going to arm Zelensky to the teeth. All of that's going to take a little time to play out, and I suspect what's going to happen is refusal from both sides. The side on which we have the most leverage is the Ukraine side. There'll be some threat or maybe actual pulling back of assistance. But Ukraine is not ours to give away, and they will continue to fight. And maybe the Europeans will step up, as we've long asked them to do. But this will have implications for the Indo-Pacific region, and it's something, as an alliance, I think we need to pay some close attention to. I think the last thing I would mention as hanging out there is the, let's say, unconventional diplomacy that President Trump was known for in his first term. I think it's not a day one, it's not probably even a year one issue, but I think he will seek to re-engage with Kim Jong-un. He will certainly do so with Xi Jinping and Putin. That will be early on, and in fact, if you believe the reporting, there's already been conversations with those leaders. But I suspect he will want to re-engage with Kim Jong-un at some point. It'll be a very different dynamic than in the first term. He, you know, the novelty of it, just the fact of the meetings was so significant. But this is a Kim Jong-un that's in a different place. He's got more advanced capabilities now. Our diplomacy did not halt their progress toward more capable strategic systems. He's got presumably the backing of Putin and Russia and more international standing because of that. And so the attempts to re-engage will have different contours to it than the first term and the two summits in Singapore and Hanoi. What that exactly looks like is hard to tell, but my guess is it will go broader than the nuclear issue. I think President Trump was, although he said in Hanoi from the podium, sometimes it's the right thing just to walk away from a bad deal. He wasn't happy that he didn't get a deal. And I think he understands that the nuclear issue is extraordinarily difficult to pry them away through diplomacy, these strategic weapons. And so I suspect the engagement would have a broader scope, and the full range of issues that we've talked about in the context of pursuing denuclearization will be on the table. So enhancing the political relationship through representation in capitals, perhaps some modest development assistance and economic cooperation, perhaps reintroducing the idea of an end to the Korean War, the official end of the Korean War. I suspect those things will be on the table, not just the nuclear issue. So I think that's not a year one thing, but that's something to keep in mind. All of this could get upended if there's a crisis in a place like the Taiwan Strait. I think my guess is deterrence holds, and I think the alarm around 2027 was maybe a bit overstated. I think, Xi Jinping has the goal to be ready and has given the direction to be ready. But in many ways, this is not a country moving on to war footing, particularly when the PLA, if you look at the degree of purging and the reforms and the purges, this does not look like a military that is necessarily going to be ready to go by 2027, even if a political decision was made to try to operationalize this sooner rather than later. And I think some of the things that we're doing with Taiwan and around Taiwan and in the context of what's happening in Ukraine is giving enough pause that we'll have a little more time to play out and strengthen our deterrence side of the equation. But I could be wrong, and that's a big thing to be wrong about. So a lot of this could really get upset in an extraordinarily significant way if there's conflict or even crisis that edges towards conflict. And that's going to place huge demands on our alliance. We'll have to be able to walk and chew gum. We'll have to be able to continue to deter North Korea from taking opportunistic steps. We'll have to be able to figure out what kind of alliance role, South Korean role there may be in these contingencies. And those are conversations best had before the fact, but my understanding is those conversations have been, let's say, slow in developing into more fulsome conversations. So I think you gave me 10 minutes and I probably took more, but if that's enough to kick us off, I'll pause there. Thanks.
Randy Shriver has given us an excellent beginning to think about how will the Trump administration deal with the strategic challenges it's facing, but what does it look like in Korea? And we couldn't have anybody better than Professor Hyung-Koo Kim, who's joining us live from Seoul. It's good evening to you, Professor Kim. He's just back in Korea. I'm sorry? He's just back in Korea from speaking here in Washington, and we were on the West Coast together where he was providing a great penetrating ideas about both the Korea-China relationship, the Korea-U.S. relationship going forward. So, Professor Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you for some brief insights, but thank you very much for joining us here virtually.
Okay. Thank you very much, dear. Hello, this is Hyung-Koo Kim, president of the Plaza Project affiliated to the Korean National Assembly, and also director of the U.S.-China Policy Institute at Aja University in Korea. Giving a speech at the Hudson Institute seminar is a great honor. Thank you very much, Patrick, for providing this wonderful opportunity. The world is changing dramatically and rapidly. We witness the following 5 new features of international politics in the 21st century. First, intensifying U.S.-China strategic competition. Second, the retreat of the liberal international order led by the U.S. leadership. Third, the rapid rise of China. force the rise of nationalism and protectionism and the retreat of globalization and supply chain disruptions. Finally, the multipolarization trend in international politics and the rise of a global South. These new trends have brought tremendous challenges to the securities of small and medium-sized countries, particularly South Korea. Yoon government is fully accepted the value-centered framework of the democracy versus authoritarian conflict model presented by the Biden administration. Among policy alternatives such as the ROK-US alliance or hedging diplomacy or balancing diplomacies, Yoon Suk-yeol abandoned the existing, Moon Jae-in's hedging strategy and firmly support the choice of the ROK-US alliance. Yoon's government is the most pro-US government ever in South Korea, I think. In an interview with Reuters on April 19th, 2023, Yoon admit the inevitability of the confrontation and conflict with China and Russia, and the emphasis on value diplomacy has been applied in the economy and the industrial sectors as well. The core contents of a global pivot state that he presented has been based on strengthening the ROK-US alliance and the ROK-US-Japan security cooperations. However, there are several challenges to South Korea in the severe US-China competitions, particularly in second Trump's era. I'm afraid that the ROK and the US face a series maybe crashes over different views on defense cost sharing. Trump announced a 9-fold increase in burden sharing during the presidential campaign. The ROK-US just completed the burden sharing negotiations with an annual 8.5% increase. South Korea may crash with the United States on tariffs and the reduction of subsidies on the IRA. Under the request of the US reshoring policies, South Korea invested more than any other country in the United States. However, its costs are higher than those stationed in Korea, and its efficiency is considerably low. The other challenge may come from the North Korean issues. The South Korea fears the United States will bypass South Korea in the negotiations with the DPRK. South Korea has three options: alliance and balancing and hedging in respective priorities. South Korea will most likely engage in tough diplomatic negotiations with the United States in the second term of Trump administration. The second choice is strengthening and balancing its defense capabilities and going probably nuclear if things go wrong. The third option is to hedge and diversify its partnership with Japan, Western Europe, and then Australia, probably China. Now, I witnessed the ROK-US relationship is kind of at the crossroads. South Koreans question themselves on rising issues related to the US-China strategic competition in the Trump era. How will South Korea secure economic survival space in the era of the fourth industrial revolution? How will South Korea respond to Trump's excessive demands and uncertainty? To what degrees will South Korea bear the cost incurred by the US reshoring policy? Is strengthening ROK-US alliance a necessary and sufficient condition to secure our security and prosperity? What security measures are necessary for South Korea to Trump's reduction of the US Army in the Korean Peninsula and increasing capabilities of North Korea's nuclear program? Is nuclear armament an option, or strengthening ROK, Japan, China regional cooperation, or is ROC, Japan, Austria security cooperation as an alternative. Is economic cooperation with Japan possible? Can the seventh maritime mining area negotiations, which should initiate in next year, be concluded in a win-win manner? How can South Korea secure its status in forming a new international order and establishing a supply chains? What are the lessons from the crushing defeat in the Busan Expo competition last year? How will South Korea deal with the increasing diplomatic cost centered on the ROC-US alliance? All these questions are on the rise. Let me talk about the strategic barriers of South Korea. Trump's remarks, it seems to me, they underestimate South Korea's strategic barriers. Let's talk about these barriers. First, South Korea has been a natural ally of the United States against China. Throughout history, South Korea has been invaded by foreign countries about 1,000 times, half of them from the north, currently the China. Korean nations are one of the few that survived after waging major wars against China's dynasties. Keen wariness of Chinese move and approaches reside in Koreans' DNA. Second, South Korea recorded the highest investment values in the United States in the world, providing high quality jobs for the American people. South Korea will be the most capable country in shipbuilding, repair services for US military equipment, and manufacturing products. Third, South Korea is the only country to compete with China in batteries and one of the few producing semiconductor products, which is essential for the US-China competition. Fourth, the military base in Pyeongtaek and the port in Jeju Island are the closest military bases available for the United States against China. South Korea has not pursued any check for these costs. Fifth, South Korean polls say they consistently favor the United States the most. China approached the United States favorable rate right before the SAD issues occurred. However, its favorable rate was never recovered after China adopted a threat strategy. Throughout Koreans' history, Koreans have adopted an annihilation and total war strategies against invasion and the threat of existence from foreign great powers instead of limited warfare. So in terms of Chinese views, Korea is a kind of thorny, spaces. My suggestion for the ROC-US alliance, first, South Korea and the United States must make efforts to elevate the status of the ROC-US alliance and strengthen its quality, work together. The United States alone cannot realize a new American dream. Second, South Korea is a natural ally of the United States. However, South Korea's national prestige and values for the United States should be respected, rather than the United States unilaterally enforcing the South Korea. Third, South Korea and US must establish a collaborative strategic frameworks for new world order and supply chains. Fourth, both should promote new communication and engagement with the DPRK, combining diplomacy and economic method rather than pursuing unilateral pressure strategies. They should also invite the DPRK to join the international society. So we should, change the kind of our, previous strategies to much more flexible and multi-phased strategies. Fifth, cooperation in economy, science, and technology is essential to ROC-US security and also alliance in the future. both need to strengthen policy coordination and investment in these areas. Anyway, thank you for listening. My time is almost up, so I hope to increase communication and collaboration between my Plaza project and Hudson Institute in the future, and also the personal collaboration between Cronin and me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. You can see why Professor Kim has been invited to virtually every different advisory board for every senior official in recent Korean governments. He is a valuable resource. He's a free thinker and very creative. So thank you, Professor Kim. Finally, before we go to our panel, it's a great honor to bring kind of the next generation. And this is sort of an investment that we're very committed to here at Hudson, which is to ensure that it's not just Professor Kim and I, and talking about, or Randy and I reminiscing over the last 30 years. It's thinking very much about the next 30 years. And it's been a great pleasure to have Yain Nam as our Korean Foundation Research Assistant to me and helping here at Hudson these past number of months. And the one issue that we had asked her to focus on was to think about, what about Taiwan? So let's have her advice to both the South Korean government and the American government. Where do they start on this issue of Taiwan? So Yain, over to you for a few minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, first, thank you, Dr. Cronin, for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of such distinguished experts. I'm Yain Nam, Dr. Cronin's Korea Foundation Research Assistant. Today, I'm gonna discuss South Korea's strategic choices for the Taiwan contingency. So South Korea has been remarkably cautious about the Taiwan contingency to the extent that taking a single step forward seems daunting. However, I would argue that it is now time for South Korea to engage. First, South Korea is already deeply intertwined with Taiwan in geopolitical and economic terms. Bloomberg Economics recently reported that if the Taiwan Strait were to be blocked by China, South Korea's GDP could drop by 23%. It is the second most affected country after Taiwan. Moreover, the two primary stakeholders in the Taiwan issues are the United States, South Korea's ally, and China, South Korea's top trade partners. Thus, South Korea's eventual participation is inevitable. At this juncture, what should South Korea consider for a strategic choice? The first would be the importance of the alliance. The Global Taiwan Institute conducted a very interesting survey. The question asked, if the US did not defend Taiwan in the case of attack by China, how worried would you be that the US would not also not support South Korea if North Korea were to attack? The result revealed a significant difference between South Korean Democratic Party supporters and People Power Party supporters. Surprisingly, pro-China DP supporters appeared less worried, showing ungrounded strong trust in the US-ROK alliance. Paradoxically, I believe this permits anti-alliance behavior. This is far from the reality. The term alliance does not guarantee everything. The second consideration is the President Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy and his vision of global pivotal state. South Korea has various pathways, including cooperation with Japan, a partnership with Southeast Asian countries, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait issue. By contributing the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, South Korea could assert its leadership in regional security. To summarize, I believe the Taiwan Strait issue aligns with a realistic understanding of the alliance, South Korea's aspiration for regional security leadership, and the convergence of both. And one concern would be that aiding Taiwan might weaken deterrence against the North. However, most expect South Korea to provide indirect support, such as logistical or technological assistance, rather than direct military aid. Furthermore, South Korea must consider how the international community, including the US, would respond in the face of North Korean invasion after failing to assist Taiwan. Concerning China, that still remains traumatic, but we need to understand that Taiwan Strait's peace and stability is critical to South Korea's national interest. And recent global trade shifts like decoupling policies have reduced South Korea's economic dependence on China. So lastly, let us consider the potential implications of the new Trump administration. During his latest campaign, Trump was ambiguous about Taiwan. However, we should recall his first administration. While he used often the rhetoric as a tool to exert influence, Trump's actual actions matters more. He passed the Taiwan Travel Act, approved arms sales to Taiwan, and also sent Alex Wong to Taiwan. Also, it is important to note that Taiwan issue is not merely about the U.S.-Taiwan relations. It is more likely about U.S.-China relations. So I think it is unlikely that Trump would easily overlook Taiwan issue as it represents a critical point of conflict between the two powers. In conclusion, South Korea must now engage with the Taiwan issue. I believe that by reflecting on the reality of the alliance and adopting a forward-looking strategic diplomacy, South Korea can make a sound, strategic choice. Yes, these are my thoughts. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well,
Order? There was an order,
I
I think.
think Jennifer was going to sit on the end.
Yeah, I'll send her.
Right here. And then I'll sit, and then Scott, and then Well, we are running a little behind, but again, we're going to turn to each of these four distinguished panelists and experts for some opening sort of thoughts on what they think, especially in the area that they're so heavily experts in. And Jennifer, you know, your work on the economy and thinking about the business sector as well. So much of the competition that we've been talking about that the United States is facing, and what we heard from Randy Shriver in terms of the Trump administration's focus is very much a business and economic focus when it thinks about the China challenge. From your position as an expert now at the Asia Group, but who's worked across these issues, where would you begin? What are your initial thoughts on dealing with the U.S.-ROK relationship from this more economic lens?
Right. Well, thank you, Patrick, for having me here. I'm Jennifer Lee. I'm a principal at the Asia Group, and I manage the Korea practice there. I would like to start by saying that, you know, as everyone know, and both Randy and Patrick mentioned before, the U.S.-ROK alliance, a core development in the past couple of administrations, and especially in the Biden administration, was that it's not just in the realm of traditional national security, but it has become kind of spilled over to the economic security, and it is just as important as the traditional national security realm. And I believe that that is an area that the government will have to keep in mind first and foremost. The South Koreans has expressed some confidence in dealing with the incoming Trump administration, thinking that the Trump administration is a sort of a known quantity, and that, you know, he is more transactional. He prefers, you know, bilateralism as opposed to multilateralism. That he has a deep focus on trade balance and fairness. But at the same time, things are very different from 2017. It's vis-a-vis Russia, China, and also North Korea, but also the technology development since then has changed significantly. There is so much emphasis on the AI and the semiconductors, quantum, and there is a lot more area to cooperate on. So this is something that that should not be forgotten. And so there is a level of anxiety even in South Korea. And if you see the media, it's just very alarmist, especially in the past year or so. They've been preparing for the Trump administration with severe, like deep scenario analysis going on. But this is not just in the media, but also the government, but also by the company executives that have invested severely in the past 4 or 5 years in the United States. They have pivoted away from China and more towards the United States. So there is a lot of anxiety there. I would like to say that just in general, as Randy mentioned, the first policies that will be introduced will likely be on the trade tariff side, in addition to the SMA possibly, and of course, FTA renegotiation. Those are all on the table. And it is still, when these tariffs, because South Korea is such an export-oriented economy, it will impact them directly and also indirectly. And it's not just the China tariff, like 60%, China-specific tariff, but also the universal tariff. They say that it doesn't even need congressional action. For example, some of the candidates like Lighthizer did say that he would use the IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and he can use that to implement the 10%, 20% universal tariff. And that will cause quite a bit of havoc in the trade relationship with EU and all basically the supply chain. So what I would just say is that, I'm taking a bit long, but the US government will have to, while these might be inevitable in that it is a broader initiative of the government, he wants to reset all the trade relationship, but at the same time, you would have to consider areas of cooperation, highlight those areas. Like, it doesn't need to just be the emerging and critical energy space, but it could be the data center, it could be the nuclear energy where SMR, small modular reactors for the data centers, AI data centers is critical. And then also the LNG part where South Korea is a consumer, collaborate with Japan to import more of the US LNG and things like that. There are so many areas that they can cooperate in, and that should go hand in hand, and that should be highlighted going forward.
That's terrific. Jennifer Lee's, shaping a lot of business portfolios out there, I suspect, because she's got deep expertise on these issues, both from Korean banks and Samsung Research Institute and going on to the Peterson Institute and working at Eurasia Group before landing as a principal at the Asia Group. So she really knows what she's talking about. The same can be said about Ankit Panda on nuclear issues. I read everything Ankit does because I always learn from on these issues. There's always more to learn. I don't know how he's so prolific and is able to show up at so many different events as well, but we deeply appreciate him. He is a Stanton Nuclear Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but really his books are must-reads on nuclear issues. I assign them to my students at Carnegie Mellon. They write book reviews on your books, and they're all very impressed as well. So Ankit, over to you for trying to help frame what is one of the thorniest and growing challenges we face right now, which is the nuclear dimension of this problem.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's good to be here with you today. I know we're behind time, so I'll try to be rather organized in just how I present, I think, 4 key thoughts on the nuclear environment that the US-ROK alliance will have to navigate in the coming years. So first, let me begin with what's happening here in the United States. We are at the cusp, I believe, in the United States of making perhaps the most significant adjustment to our strategic nuclear posture since the end of the Cold War. And what I mean by that is, since 1991, the size of the US nuclear arsenal, the salience of nuclear weapons in US national defense have broadly been on a trend line downwards. And that includes deployed numbers, that includes reductions as a result of arms control with the Russian Federation. All of that, I think, is about to end. The New START treaty formally expires in February 2026, but Russia suspended its implementation of that treaty. The United States reciprocated by ceasing to implement its obligations under the treaty, but both the United States and Russia essentially have a political understanding at the moment to observe the so-called central limits under that treaty, essentially the numeric ceiling for our intercontinental range ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. It is my sense that in the first year of the Trump administration, prior to the formal expiration of New START, it's very likely that we will see a political decision made by the administration to authorize an increase. And so the reason this has implications, obviously, for the ROK is that as an extended deterrence recipient and a treaty ally, South Korea will clearly have an interest in shaping and consulting with the new administration on the implications of those changes. Let me also be specific about what those changes will look like, because the only thing that can really happen in the short term, the United States cannot conjure new nuclear capabilities or delivery systems out of thin air. But what we can do is begin slowly uploading more warheads onto our land-based intercontinental range ballistic missiles, and at a slower pace, our sea-based nuclear forces. It's slower because the submarines have to come back in and get re-uploaded. But that ultimately opens the aperture, I think, on the kinds of conversations that can happen within the alliance on nuclear matters. The second point I want to make is about the Washington Declaration and the Nuclear Consultative Group. These were, of course, the big software upgrades that the alliance received to address many of the anxieties in Seoul about the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, and in the United States about the nuclear weapons debate in South Korea. I always like to point out that the Washington Declaration was a two-way exchange of assurances between our two countries. My sense is that under the Trump administration, the future of the Washington Declaration is somewhat indeterminate. I do think in the first year we will see the NCG likely persist. My understanding is that there is enough of a work plan to allow, at least at the bureaucratic level, our two countries to continue working on many of the processes that were initiated, the tabletop exercises, the nuclear education, so on and so forth. But my advice essentially for South Korea would be, to the extent possible, receiving at the highest levels of the new administration, if not a allusion to the Washington Declaration itself, a commitment by the United States to uphold the principles that were articulated in that document, to include the highest levels of consultation between the President of the United States and the President of the Republic of Korea in a nuclear crisis. Let me shift now to North Korea. Next year, again, is a critical period on the Korean Peninsula because North Korea's 5-year plan of military modernization announced in January 2021 will likely look to conclude. There are still a few things we're anticipating to see from the North Koreans, the nuclear test, the 7th nuclear test being, of course, a major factor. My belief is that Kim Jong-un will look to conclude this modernization period with such a nuclear test. It's obvious that that will have implications for the intra-alliance conversation, the public debate in South Korea and Washington. It will feature very nicely into North Korea's broader push to decouple and apply pressure on the alliance. So we, of course, need to be vigilant to this possibility. But at the same time, I think we will see a dynamic similar to 2017, where North Korea will take the initiative in galvanizing interest here in the United States. And so to that extent, I agree with Randy in particular, that we should not rule out the possibility of U.S.-North Korea engagement coming as a result of North Korean action. And then one last point I want to make is something I sort of see flying under the radar or perhaps not discussed, is North Korea's participation in Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine as a co-belligerent. The North Koreans have a treaty with the Russian Federation. They have a public legal basis for participation in this conflict. And I think what we underrate is the possibility in some kind of settlement or negotiation between Zelensky, Putin, Trump, various European leaders, that the North Koreans themselves could actually look to have a seat at the table as a co-belligerent in talks over a settlement in this European war. That has implications, I think, because it raises the possibility that the opening for U.S.-North Korea engagement is not going to be over the denuclearization portfolio or over matters pertaining to Northeast Asia, but actually the settlement of the Ukraine conflict. I know it's rather speculative at the moment, but we have to ask ourselves why Kim Jong-un, beyond sending munitions, would actually send troops to this war, taking what is arguably a significant risk for himself and his own regime. I mean, North Korea is very sensitive to having people returning from overseas with certain ideas. There will be North Korean troops returning from the battlefield, so Kim is taking substantial risks, I think, for his own regime here. But arguably, this would be one of the upshots. We are seeing evidence that Kim Jong-un, as a result of his growing capabilities, is more confident on the global stage, is more willing to take risks today. And this could be one of the ways in which that risk-taking pays off with a very large international profile, where North Korea could be implicated in a Ukraine armistice or settlement agreement. So I'll stop there, Patrick. Thank you.
Well, that's terrific. Professor Park Jae-jok is one of the leading experts in Korea on Korean-U.S. alliance, on Korean foreign and defense policy, including indeed on North Korea issues. And it's a great pleasure to have you here. You're from one of the leading universities in the world, too. Yonsei University is a great university, and you are the Associate Dean of the Graduate School of International Studies. So we're very honored to have you here. Professor Park.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me here today. You know, in Seoul, everyone expects that U.S. is going to pressure us to pay more. So general sentiment in Seoul is that we should pay more prudently, and we should gain more in return. So in this context, I'd like to make 4 points. 2 with respect to South Korea paying more, and the other two regarding what South Korea gained from the United States. The first in Seoul. So we are concerned that the Trump administration may threaten us with the withdrawal of U.S. troops or significant reduction in its numbers. So it's generally perceived in Seoul that this is means to pressure South Korea to pay more with respect to special measures agreement. But that said, though, some argue in South Korea that since the United States is very likely, as the keynote speaker mentioned this morning, that U.S. is going to tighten both economic and military pressure on China. The U.S. may want to expand the Pyeongtaek military base in South Korea, which is currently the largest of its kind in Asia, 3 times or triple times, or triple times, and increasing rather than decreasing, and reorganizing USFK in order to make them be more prepared for outer peninsula missions. So I was wondering whether in the United States there are any discussions along that lines. Second point, South Korea has pursued this Indo-Pacific strategies, which in many parts aligns with the United States. We have been making strong commitment to contributing more to regional maritime security issues. In South Korea, it is perceived as, in some part, it's an investment in the US-ROK alliance by accommodating US strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific. As China has been very assertive both in Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. So in this context, we know that the quad states, security quad states comprised of the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines have been conducting joint military exercises and maritime patrol in the West Philippine Sea. Then the question is that whether South Korea should join the United States along with Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. The pro side argues that South Korea should enhance South Korea's positional power within the US-led security network. The con side claims that South Korea should exercise caution in order not to unnecessarily provoke China. So here then, in this debate, what should be carefully considered is whether the United States will continue the momentum of a Quad by arranging various unilateral security mechanisms in the Pacific. If the United States continues to continue this momentum, then South Korea should join the Quad as a part of South Korea's investment in the US-ROK alliance, as well as contributing to regional security issues as a global pivotal power. But if the United States pulls back from this momentum, then South Korea should exercise caution in joining the Squad. So I guess here the question is that whether the Trump administration is going to continue, the framing the various unilateral security cooperation mechanisms in the Pacific. The third point is that in South Korea now there is a rapidly growing attention to the MRO, maintenance and repair and overhaul industry in South Korea, as President-elect Trump mentioned it during his conversation with President Yoon Suk-yeol. Now, it is a big economic opportunity for South Korea, but the problem is that in South Korea now there's only one dock available for MRO activities. That's why there is a very growing attention on Subic Bay in the Philippines. I understand that the United States, Australia, Japan have been working toward to expand the Subic Bay twice or 3 times, so in order to use it as a hub of U.S. MRO activities for the U.S. naval ships operating in the Indo-Pacific. Then, from South Korea's perspective, working with the United States, Japan, Australia is in the Subic Bay is killing 2 birds with 1 stone. One bird is obviously South Korea's economic interest. The other bird is investing in the US-ROK alliance by accommodating U.S. strategic interest in maintaining U.S. naval power in the Pacific. The fourth point is that South Korea is a concern, as pointed by the keynote speaker and others, that U.S. may engage in bilateral discussions with North Korea, sidelining South Korea, and shifting its focus to risk management or risk reduction rather than adhering to the spirit of CVID. So South Korea hopes that the Trump administration will maintain close consultation with South Korea if the United States indeed engage with North Korea. So in this context, it's unclear to me that even if United States like to engage with North Korea for arms reduction talks, not quite sure, unclear that North Korea might respond to the United States. That's because North Korea has now higher chance of acquiring ICBM SBL capabilities from Russia due to it's sending troops to Russia in order to support Russia in the Ukraine war. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
That's a fine. Thank you very much. I mean, we've already heard the challenges are even richer than we can keep growing the list of challenges that we're talking about that face the U.S. and South Korea. There are undoubtedly fears and uncertainties that are coming. We've heard now repeatedly from our allies. Our allies have options. There are hedging strategies. There are options to increase or decrease different policies, and so that's going to be an important dynamic to watch. But there are also these enormous opportunities in trying to come together in new ways to deal with challenges. The lines all come down to people, ultimately. And it's easy to talk about money and nuclear weapons and the alliance sort of machinations, but what about where do people stand on this? Whether it's thinking about the implication of the peninsula and North Korean human rights or the lack thereof, or U.S. ROK values. Olivia Enos has been following this very closely here in Washington for years, and she's been dealing with top officials here in the United States and in South Korea. So Olivia, it's a great honor to have you join this panel to discuss your thoughts about the human rights and democracy issue.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for having me today. I think we are at such an interesting crossroads in U.S.-Korea relations, especially when it comes to addressing North Korean human rights issues. As the Trump administration takes the helm, they are inheriting a few things from the Biden administration that I think are worth keeping in mind. First, they're inheriting a much stronger Indo-Pacific alliance framework. I would say, arguably, that will be the legacy of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific policies. And a lot of this, as Randy mentioned at the outset, is the result of the Camp David summit, where commitments were made on a wide range of issues, not just relating to security and economic challenges, but also on human rights issues. I think, unfortunately, the Trump administration is also inheriting something else, which was a relatively weak and inattentive North Korea policy over the last 4 years. I think you did have a lot of strong movement coming out of the U.S. ambassador for North Korean human rights issues, but when it came to East Asia Pacific Bureau and a lot of State Department initiatives, North Korea was almost entirely eclipsed by efforts to try and tackle the China challenge. And in some regards, that's rightfully so. I would argue that China is the major foreign policy challenge and the pacing threat. But the lack of attention to North Korea has allowed a number of things to happen that are definitely at odds with U.S. interests. And so a Trump administration will have to really think about what the future of U.S. strategy toward North Korea looks like. The Trump administration is also inheriting a few ongoing realities that don't have anything to do with the Biden administration. This has been mentioned throughout, and I think it's an encouraging factor. The Trump second term is happening amidst much warmer U.S.-South Korea relationships. The anti-U.S. sentiment that you had under the Moon administration just is not there under the Yoon administration, and President Yoon himself has made clear that North Korean human rights issues are a priority for South Korean foreign policy. And I think this is really encouraging when we think about potential areas for alignment between the U.S. and South Korea. The second reality that they're inheriting is that the United Nations is slated to issue its update to the 2014 Commission of Inquiry report. And that's coming out in September 2025, so next year. the Commission of Inquiry report was a seminal report. It was the first time that we had extraordinarily concrete and clear evidence that the North Korean people face ongoing crimes against humanity. And I would say arguably diplomats in Washington, Seoul, and around the world were not able to deny the severity of the ongoing human rights crisis. I think the release of the update to the COI, being able to give us new information about what's been happening over the last 10 years, has the potential to breathe new life into broader US and global efforts to tackle the North Korean challenge. And so this creates a very interesting environment in which the Trump administration, as well as Congress, has the potential to move forward progress on the North Korean human rights issue, recognizing also that while we often tackle human rights issues separately from security concerns, there are often some very important overlaps in the two. And when we fail to address the North Korean human rights issues, we leave important diplomatic leverage on the table. I think these conditions provide a really nice foundation upon which a new administration can and should prioritize North Korean human rights issues. And to that end, I wanted to list 5 potential areas of action. The first, and I want to be clear on this, Biden administration could also do this in the final days before we have a next Trump administration, but I would love to see the US actually issue an atrocity determination saying whether North Koreans face not only ongoing crimes against humanity, which the UN was clear about, but also potentially genocide. And I have a report that I wrote here at Hudson that goes into the details of why I believe both that North Koreans may be facing both ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. The reason why I think this is an important first move is because previous atrocity determinations issued, for example, for Uyghur Muslims, for over ISIS issues or Burma, led to a lot of follow-on action, and I'd love to see the following follow-on actions happen. I'd love to see Congress reprioritizing North Korean human rights issues. The North Korean Human Rights Act is lapsed at its 20th anniversary, and it's important to bear in mind that US policy isn't only made by the executive branch. We have a mandate in Congress where there's unity between both the Senate and the House, and so that's a real mandate for leadership to act. And so reauthorizing the North Korean Human Rights Act is something that should be at least under consideration. Third, I'd love to see Washington and Seoul reinvigorate cooperation over efforts to improve information access in North Korea, which is often a lifeline for many North Koreans who are escaping, and also to better prioritize resettlement of North Korean refugees, both in Seoul, but also in the US. The fourth bucket of issues is to make demands over access to political prison camps and to actually demand the release of individuals from those political prison camps. Perhaps even, and this is on my final point, if there were to be a resumption of diplomacy between Trump and Kim, one of the things that was really overlooked under the first efforts at diplomacy was the inclusion of human rights issues in the actual diplomatic meetings. There was a lot of raising and discussion of North Korean human rights issues in the lead up to both the Trump-Kim summits in Singapore and in Hanoi, but when it came to actually meeting at the diplomatic table, it was as if the North Korean human rights issues no longer mattered. I think it is a lost art in Washington to create diplomatic leverage when we're seeking to make different objectives, whether that's in the security, economic, or human rights realm. And I think that many of the human rights issues could be used to create diplomatic leverage and opportunities for greater progress on both the nuclear issues and on some of the economic issues as well. So.
Well, thank you. And everything is on the table so far for a second Trump administration because it won't begin until late January. But it's a real challenge to try to balance the human rights agenda, the democracy agenda with the economic-led sort of focus of competition, the real nuclear dangers that are lurking, the real challenges of how you deal with South Korea's interests fairly on why you change your own priorities. All of these are posing a complex set of challenges. I wonder if I can just go back to each panelist and try to dig a little deeper on some of the issues that are right there in front of us on day one, probably, of a Trump administration. So, Jennifer Lee, in terms of tariffs, day one. Significant new tariffs on China.
Yes.
what is the result in Korea? You know, what is the immediate impact, and what are the things that Korea can do to buffer itself as it prepares for that kind of tariff war?
So there is still a lot of uncertainty on what that would look like in terms of would that exempt the countries that have an FTA relationship with the United States? Will there be any exemption? The broader idea is that initially, what it would do is that China, the number one impact would be that China would consider real retaliation. And that could impact like anything from exports of critical minerals that is important for the semiconductor industry and all the other stuff. But also the fact that China has an overcapacity issue already. And when when the US door closes, then all that overcapacity will go to other countries like South Korea, EU, Southeast Asia, South America. And what that would do is it would have place a price pressure, making all of these products from the other countries much more less competitive. So there is that, it's very, very complex, but at the same time, like just in general, also because a lot of things go through China, and also because South Korea made a lot of investment in the United States, they still get a lot of the materials from China, and that cost will also go up, which will make operating in the United States a lot more difficult as well.
Terrific. And Ankit, you raised a lot of good points, and the Ukraine one is really interesting and needs more discussion. I'm going to actually turn to Professor Park in a minute and try to get his understanding of what South Korea thinks about the next steps in this Korean-Russian conflict with North Korea's role. But I want to come back to extended deterrence and good and bad ideas for improving extended deterrence, in your view, in terms of nuclear latency. You've written about this, and you've said it's harder than it looks. But should that be something the U.S. and South Korea, in part of a larger reframing of this relationship going forward, should study? Furthermore, as a government to government, think about what are the realistic options for moving our South Korean ally closer to having nuclear capabilities, or should we just stay away from that completely because of its sort of threat to the nuclear nonproliferation regime and other norms that we've been trying to establish? In addition to that, what is the value of taking that nuclear consultative group in the Washington process, Washington Declaration, to a trilateral, adding Japan in, given the fact that this Camp David agreement and the growing cooperation is clearly a common interest, I think, between Yoon and Trump, and has been with Biden as well. So if I can ask you those two tough questions on extended deterrence and on maybe trilateral extended deterrence strategy.
Sure. So I'll start with your second one because I think it's actually a little bit easier to deal with, which is that I think that's a good idea. I think it's overdue, and I think with granted politics in Japan being in a little bit of flux, but what's interesting about trilateralism under the second Trump administration compared to the first is that during the first Trump administration we did not have a demand signal from Japan and South Korea for intensifying trilateralism, right? And we didn't have a demand signal in Washington either, because that was something that the outgoing Obama administration had started to pursue. Tony Blinken, as deputy secretary, had started convening at the trilateral level with his counterparts in Japan and the ROK. And so the Camp David spirit and the Camp David Declaration, as long as I think Japan and Korea can identify that not necessarily as a Biden idea or anything like that, and just presenting that as essentially a good idea. We have the demand signal in both capitals. We have a Northeast Asian structural environment now where interests, I think, very strongly will compel the United States, Japan, and South Korea to also consult in these new ways. To the extent possible, I think that would be a good step. What I would just say at the very margins of this, I would not advocate for turning the NCG into a trilateral format. I think we will need something meaningfully new in Northeast Asia. You can call it something else entirely, a strategic consultation mechanism, a strategic policy dialogue between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. I don't use the word nuclear because that might make it a little bit more difficult for our Japanese friends to present to their own publics. So strategic might be a good word for that. So I think that's entirely there. I think a lot will depend, again, on process. Do we have an Office of the Secretary of Defense that is staffed up and ready to introduce these kinds of new ideas or take them to a point where we can actually begin to implement them? I wouldn't necessarily think that we'll be there in the first 6 to 12 months, but I think eventually over time, there's a lot of room there. On the latency thing, I think, Patrick, you're getting at something very interesting, which is that the second Trump administration, I think, will genuinely raise the possibility of a U.S. administration that takes a very different approach to non-proliferation questions. I mean, non-proliferation is a central component of the United States post-Second World War grand strategy. Not to be too ahistorical, but really it's something we committed to in the 1960s. We saw a world with more nuclear decision-making centers, be they friendly or adversarial to the United States, as unfavorable for our interests, and that has enjoyed bipartisan support. There is a question mark over this, over the extent to which this might change. You have a Secretary of State in Marco Rubio, where I think you would have a traditional approach to nonproliferation, as Senator Rubio has been involved in supporting nonproliferation legislation in a number of ways. But at the same time, you will have a president who's publicly said that it might be a good idea for allies to seek nuclear weapons. You have certain advisors who don't really have a view on this matter. And we all know that 70% of the Korean public feels that nuclear weapons may be necessary, and that even many strategic elites in South Korea hold a similar view. So this question of latency, I think, will genuinely be on the table for the United States. I think the question mark is, will you see a U.S. administration, despite the deeply ingrained preference in the United States for nonproliferation, move in a direction of tolerating, if not an overt move by South Korea towards nuclear weapons capability, then certain kinds of technical work that could increase that latency. And here I think what's also interesting is that this conversation we're having is obviously going to be one that I think is going to reverberate in Beijing and Moscow, where both those countries, of course, have their own interests in nonproliferation. The question mark is we see a lot of divergence right now between the US, China, and Russia on nonproliferation matters. And so I think this will certainly bear on South Korean interests, South Korea's national conversation. My personal view is that extended deterrence is a much greater certainty despite the uncertain environment we're ending, right? And that 4 years, I think we heard earlier today from Randy why 4 years can be both a long time and a short time in international politics. The world is very different than it was 4 years ago, but from the perspective of managing an alliance with the United States that might not talk to South Korea in the way that South Korea might want and might not even present some of the ideas that South Korea might otherwise want to see, dealing with that might be ultimately a lot safer for both the US and South Korea, I would argue, than taking the leap into the unknown that latency or proliferation represents.
Yeah, it turns out that existing ideas are probably a lot stronger than we think sometimes. We beat them down a lot. I'm thinking of China championing, free trade, and yet you compare American markets still being open and freer and not having the kind of state-owned subsidies and enterprises involved. It's just but we think free trade is somehow, we're walking away from it when in fact, no, the world has already walked away from some of it. So the issue of Ukraine war, Professor Pak, you raised very important points, obviously about staying aligned on North Korean talks, which is very important. But Ankit Pand has raised the idea of North Korea could actually come out of the Ukraine war as sort of a signatory co-belligerent. And I've heard expressed from senior South Korean officials the idea that North Korea's main interest in helping Russia is to offset Chinese influence. And now, obviously, the technology benefits that we've heard from Admiral Paparo speculating yesterday that they're surely going to be asking for things like submarine technology and other technologies. But from your perspective, what are South Korea's options for dealing with North Korea's growing involvement in the Ukraine war to help Russia and their growing relationship with Russia?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not quite sure whether China is unhappy with the recent rapprochement between Russia and North Korea. In South Korea, many claim that China is not happy because Russia is going to provide space technology to North Korea that only provide a justification for the United States and Japan and South Korea strengthen trilateral alliance relationship. I'm not quite sure whether China is not unhappy.
So you're skeptical.
I'm very skeptical about it. So in some sense, I think that China is happy about it. But the only thing that China concerns is that Russia might use some of North Korean ports for military purposes. Now Russia has been using Najin for commercial purposes. But what if Russia deploy submarines Najin? So that is going to be huge implication for strategic landscape in North Korea. So your question is that how can South Korea make Russia and North Korea cooperation less intensive? in that purpose, the South Korean government is claiming that South Korea can send the weapons to Ukraine, but I'm not quite sure whether South Korean government really mean it, because who knows that Trump is going to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours. The keynote speaker said that it's very doubtful, but nevertheless, there is going to be the talks for halting the war or ending the war. Then so that sending weapons to Ukraine is not a good option. Okay? But we are very much worried that as a result of North Korea sending troops to Ukraine, North Korea can become more belligerent. When in case of Korean contingency, we all expect that China is going to intervene. But now we should expect not only China, but also Russia might intervene. We can rule out the possibility. So that the threshold South Korea and the United States respond to North Korea militarily becomes higher than before. Knowing that threshold becomes higher than before, North Korea can become more belligerent. So that from day one of the Trump administration, we can expect North Korea will become more provocative. Can be the seventh nuclear test, additional ballistic missile test, or provocations in the West Sea, so on and so forth. So I think the only thing we can do is the strengthening our alliance relationship with the United States and Japan, and sending very strong signal to China that if you do not step in, then we have no choice, but to strengthen the trilateral security cooperation to the extent that we are forming the Quad trilateral alliance system.
It's very thoughtful, and there's no one answer to what China's thinking about North Korea's involvement here. I think this is a complicated analysis. I was struck when I was at Yangchang Island and watching the fishing trawlers, the Chinese fishing trawlers sitting on the northern limit line, suggesting to me that China's not, well, one, they want to watch and make sure what's happening, so by all means, let their fishermen fish and watch what's happening. Two, I think Xi Jinping told President Biden on the margins of the APEC summit, or was it, the margins of the APEC summit in Lima, that he, China's not going to let conflict start, essentially. I mean, he essentially said that this is not something that China's going to sit idly by and let the conflict start. So it has an interest in maintaining the peace as well. In putting the onus on China, to have them own that, it seems like not a bad approach for maybe the Yoon and Trump administrations to try to figure out a way to use that as leverage. And conversely, if they don't help constrain potential provocations, maybe it's the nuclear test, not the northern limit line, then we will make sure that our policies toward China are not necessarily helpful either when we think about our competition. I want to come back to Olivia and profoundly sort of tragic kind of human stories that you watch on a regular basis. I'm thinking about institutionally, though. You mentioned the Commission of Inquiry. We've lost the United Nations framework, though, on this issue, right? To so much because Russia and because of the lack of major power harmony on these issues. Maybe there will be negotiations in the coming years that put that back together, but I don't expect that to be a day one issue. So what are the options realistically for the Trump administration and for the Yoon administration institutionally to amplify the kinds of issues you're talking about on North Korean human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be so incredible if you had Seoul and Washington actually issuing jointly an atrocity determination for North Korea. And that could be even different from what the COI concludes. Like if the COI says it's only just ongoing crimes against humanity at the UN level, the US, it's at the discretion of the Secretary of State any day of the week. Secretary Blinken and potentially Secretary Rubio could say, we have full confidence that the North Korean people face ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. And I believe this would result in a tectonic shift in terms of US government resources that are going towards tackling these issues. And if it was done jointly with Seoul, because as I mentioned, I think you have much greater opportunities for US-South Korean cooperation under a second Trump term than you did under a first. I really do think you have the potential to see quite big changes. One other thing I would just note too is that, while we don't know whether Trump will go back to the negotiating tables with Kim Jong-un, or even whether that's a super wise idea, if he does, it's important to remember that Congress has issued some of the strongest sanctions actually on the book through the North Korean Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act. And any sort of sanctions relief for those specific targeted sanctions are tied not only to forward progress on denuclearization, but also requires forward progress on human rights. So when you go to the negotiating table with Pyongyang, you have to bear that in mind, that pre-existing US law mandates that sanctions relief cannot be offered without forward progress on human rights too. So it doesn't make sense even in a unilateral negotiation setting to leave human rights issues off the table. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And while you've just sort of told us this answer, I want to ask you again, because I want to ask each panelist as we sort of conclude this session, what is your number one recommendation to the incoming Trump administration on issues that relate to the U.S.-Korea alliance? What is most meaningful advice you would want to give, or recommendation you'd want to make to do or not to do, but that has a realistic chance of being plausible at least? So Olivia?
For me, it would definitely be issuing that atrocity determination, but I think it would also be better cooperation and coordination between the executive branch and Congress when it comes to ensuring the streamlining and the consistency of U.S. policy on North Korean human rights issues. And I would just urge anyone coming in at the working level to think very, very seriously about the interconnectedness of the human rights issues to the security issues. The regime makes unbelievable amounts of money through the exploitation of its people through forced labor abroad and domestically. Many of those proceeds likely help to fund the nuclear program. The fact that these issues are so interconnected, and you hosted Yi Shin-hwa here who made this very point, makes it just really poor policy making to not recognize the importance of addressing both of these issues in tandem to achieve objectives on both fronts.
Great. Professor Park, your top recommendation to President-elect Trump.
Yeah. No, I would say the strong consultation with South Korea when United States deal with North Korea. Trump, the first administration, first term, back then South Korea was a Moon Jae-in government, very, which put inter-Korean relations before anything else. But now it's a very conservative government. So that if the United States talk to North Korea sidelining South Korea, that is going to significantly weaken the U.S.-ROK alliance.
It's very important. I probably shouldn't mention that the Biden administration with the trilateral process has this commitment to consult on the trilateral, that South Korea and Japan have a commitment to consult, which is very important. And maybe Japan and Korea can convince the Trump administration that that's a similar principle that would be really helpful, because we're essentially trying to achieve the same thing here. Even if we now have new ways of wanting to achieve it, let's think together about what are the smart ways to do this, so we can be prepared to maneuver and make changes and make adjustments on all sides to achieve what we're both trying to achieve, which is to deal with this North Korean threat and to reduce it and to preserve our democracies, to preserve our prosperity. So thank you very much. Ankit, you've got probably a long list of things, but what's on the top of your list of recommendations?
Well, so the big one is alliances are assets, not liabilities for the United States. I think that's important. That's not a recommendation. I mean, that's essentially a statement of, I think, U.S. interests, as I and many others, I think, in this town see it. I don't think that many in the new administration will share that view, so I think it's worth saying that out loud, even though it might seem obvious to those of us gathered in this room. But the second thing I want to just say, Patrick, is, so it's no secret that I've been critical of U.S.-North Korea policy for about 8 years now, perhaps longer. And so I do think we saw in the first Trump administration a willingness to take risks. I would argue that the Singapore to Hanoi to the brief DMZ summit and the October 2019 meeting that Steve Biegun had finally didn't really move the needle on denuclearization. But I think if there is a lesson to take away from there, I think, I continue to think that it is long past due for the United States to reassess fundamentally the first principles that drive our interests vis-a-vis North Korea. But of course, I'm wary, and this is why I began my answer by talking about alliances as assets. I'm worried that the Trump administration will do the right thing from my perspective, but in a way that is perhaps not how I would do it, or without consulting South Korea. And so I do want to emphasize that while I would continue to support an adjustment in our North Korea policy that would reduce the risk of nuclear conflict in Northeast Asia, in my view, I think it's very important to do that in tandem with South Korea, fully understanding the sensitivities that Seoul has about the precedents that might be set vis-a-vis North Korea, or the ways in which an agreement with North Korea on reducing the threat disproportionately reduces the threat to the United States without addressing the very real and growing tactical nuclear weapons threat on the Korean Peninsula. So I'll stop there.
It should be possible to question our basic assumptions about nuclear policy and at the same time preserve the alliance. But doing that and saying it are two different things, so well said. Jennifer Lee, you're going to get the final word here on this panel. It's been a great discussion, but we're back on the economic agenda writ large. What's your number one recommendation to the incoming Trump administration?
I mean, so I do deal with business, but my firm considers ourselves to be in the juncture of, business, policy, politics, everything, defense. We have an array of clients from all kinds of industries. So what I would like to say is that given this environment where everything is intertwined, really, like all of our topics are intertwined, you can't single out like an area that you will just focus on. And I did hear from a source that there are some people in the first term of the Trump administration just like walking over without interagency consultation and whatnot. And I think that's a very, very important component that the US government should think about, because it's not just about consulting the counterpart, but also interagency-wise. This will have an immense impact in the counterpart country. And the thing is that I would also highlight the fact that there is a presidential election in Korea in 2027. It's not going to be Yoon forever. The first 2 years of the Trump administration will possibly have an outsized impact on the rest of the U.S. ROC alliance. It will have a long-lasting impact. And right now, as a lot of you may know, the Yoon government is not, enjoying a high approval rating. It is at about 20% range. And he has expended a lot of his political capital on pivoting away from China towards the United States and rebuilding the relationship with Japan. We cannot ignore that fact. And while, as I said, the trade tariff agenda is fine, it can be like a national thing, but at the same time, if you're approaching something in a bilateral manner, you have to think about it more holistically. What are the impacts? What are the gains? What are the win-win situations that we can go for? And then also make sure that the first 2 years because everything is connected, one impact could have an outsized impact on other things. Like it will have a spillover effect, just like the cow disease incident in Korea or the SMA discussion. So I believe that you can face a liberal candidate 2 years later on in Korea who are going to pivot back towards China and North Korea. So I think that is a reminder that the United States government will have to think more holistically. That would be my recommendation.
So look ahead, not just at the moment here for the Trump administration, and communications will continue to be key, and not to sort of single out these sort of sudden unilateral declarations without at least helping your ally know that that's going to be on the agenda. It's one thing to put renegotiation of the special measures agreement on the agenda, but it's another not to tell South Korea in advance that that's going to be on the agenda. So very important to communicate that agenda as clearly as possible. This has been a remarkably sort of insightful session. I know it's been brief. I know you have reams of things you can write on these issues, and you have. And we were joined earlier by some great speakers with Randy Shriver and Professor Kim and Yang Nam's excellent presentation on Taiwan sort of considerations for the alliance. So thank you, all of you. Good luck to all of you. And thank you for joining us here today at Hudson Institute. Thank you.
Thank you.